afraid.
6:42, good morning to you. Let's see what's making the news for you today with the editor of Spike, Tom Slater, and PR expert Lara Fawcett. Good morning to you both. Nice to see you. Tom, let's start with the Telegraph, should we? What's going on with Vodafone?
So Vodafone, their biggest shareholder, is now the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which has prompted this intervention from Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister. He has referred to this as a threat to national security, not least because of the fact that Vodafone also own a lot of critical infrastructure, undersea cables and things of that nature.
Is Vodafone sort of previously seen as a British company?
I don't think it's a British company originally,
exactly.
but I think it's something which... as with many of these firms, obviously so many of the not just their own kind of services, but the sort of general infrastructure is something which is relied upon more broadly. And so this has raised concerns. He suggested kind of certain special measures, I think in particular. This is the thing about interventions like this. On the one hand, it sounds quite kind of sabre-rattling. It's a threat to national security, something must take place. And then you look at what's actually being proposed, and there has to be a committee that will oversee these things. And there has to be some sort of mechanism and so on. So it's something where often the bark is more significant than the bite. But the context for this, and I think why the Telegraph is certainly leading with it today, is the fact that there is this UAE-led bid to buy out the Telegraph as well, which by some of the comment pieces and some of the news pieces that the Telegraph have been publishing recently, they're not best pleased about. So there's that general sense of not only questions of critical infrastructure, but also some of our key institutions, journalistic or otherwise, being owned by foreign autocratic
But we're right to
states.
be monitoring this, aren't we, carefully?
Oh, completely.
Otherwise, it could be by stealth. You know, we could find all sorts of countries that we may once have considered friends, but not always, taking over and then becoming major shareholders in critical tech, particularly.
No, completely. And you can understand why there's going to be that concern about it. I guess the question is, what does the correct kind of action look like? Do you deprive these companies of investment that they're clearly quite desperately needing? Or do you... And also, if you are going to introduce measures, is this kind of little committee or things of this nature actually going to cut it? But as you're right, it's completely understandable there will be concerns, particularly when it's not just one acquisition, it's not just one takeover, it's the fact that all across the piece you have particular investment funds linked to particular autocratic states owning quite a large share of what are quite important British-based businesses.
It's interesting that this is reported in the Daily Telegraph as well, isn't it?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Dear me, what do you make of it, Lara?
Well, it would worry me with everything being such a tinderbox in the Middle East, having more business out there.
But we can't have everything with British infrastructure just being British, can we?
Why not?
Because we don't seem to have the money.
No, that's true.
Which is the problem. It'd be lovely if we could. Anyway, let's have a look at fighting a war. This is in the Star this morning, because there's all this talk of would there be conscription and all the rest of it, which has been ruled out by the PM. But 90% of us say we wouldn't fight for Britain.
I know, it's interesting, isn't it? So it says here, 90% of Brits say they'd refuse to fight in a war for Britain, and their claims we're too fat anyway. So maybe bring back rationing, stop people being fat for a start.
Bring back national service, a lot of people are saying, aren't
Very
they?
sensible. I do agree with that.
Do you really?
But the army thing, this was interesting. I was having a little look when I was in the green rooms. They were saying within 2 years that there's going to be fewer than 68,000 regulars in the army, and to deter an invader, we need 500,000 recruits.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And I think times have changed. We've had 70 years now since we had a last major war. And, yeah, I mean, it is a worry that people aren't... the army are going to have to change their recruitment policy. Like
But it's money. Again,
it all boils down to money. Everything's money.
We need to prioritise the armed forces a lot more, don't we? I mean, what's the old saying, you know, to prepare for peace, you have to prepare for war.
I read that this morning, yeah. And also, people have got to feel patriotic pride. I'm not sure that this younger generation, Gen Z, have got the pride that the past generations had.
They've been taught, or they've been
encouraged
to be ashamed
absolutely.
of being British and of our past. And now we're reaping the rewards of that. But also, we've become complacent. I've done so many interviews over the years with armed force leaders and politicians who say, oh, the next war is not going to be anything like the last war. The next war is going to just be fought on computers and things like that. Honestly, people have said that time and again.
Well,
and it'll be
now
fought...
look at Russia.
Yeah, it'll be fought by drones that will be operated from, the Atacama Desert or something. It's not happening like that, is it? Look at Russia and Ukraine. Look at Israel and Gaza. It's back to
proper
back to blood and guts and civilians and all the rest of it. And we're not prepared for that because we've allowed ourselves to become...
I agree. One amusing thing I read was that about the army are changing their tattoo policy. They're now letting people in, they're recruiting people with tattoos, so that might frighten the opposition.
No, but I tell you what, we mentioned this yesterday. That's got to be nonsense, because you'd never meet a soldier who hasn't got a tattoo.
So where is all that?
No, they're talking about facial tattoos and tattoos that may be obscene or deliberately frightening.
Great.
And
deliberately frightening.
That's what you want, isn't it?
Bring it on.
Yeah.
Bring it on. That's what I say.
If they're willing to fight and be trained to fight, then let them in, I think.
Tom, we're going to get more tax cuts, apparently. Jeremy Hunt's preparing to trap Labour with all of this.
Yeah, so we've heard for a good few weeks now that the Tories are planning to introduce some tax cuts ahead of the next election.
Yeah, they better add, otherwise the expectation management's damaged.
Exactly, something's gone very wrong if that's not actually what's going to happen. It seems like this is their kind of last-ditch attempt to get on the right side of the electorate. I hope that people will start to see a bit more in their pay packets as they go to vote. And a warning here from an unnamed senior Labour figure suggesting that Starmer can't fall into this trap of trying to match these tax cuts because of the state that the public finances are in and because of the fact that on public services he's going to want to deliver. Obviously, I suppose you can see the argument for this looking at the polls in particular, which is there's not an overwhelming appetite for tax cuts, shall we say. Public services tend to come high. Even amongst 2019 Tory voters, their priorities tend to be things other than tax cuts at this point, whether it's immigration, cost of living, inflation, things of this matter.
Yeah, but it's a very bad move if the Labour Party policy is ultimately going to be, on day one, we're going to put your taxes up.
And also there is that thing about what people might tell a pollster and what, when it comes to election day, and they're thinking, you know what, I have seen that extra bump recently, do I want to jeopardise that? But it's interesting in the eye, they've also got a little analysis piece from Paul Lewis from Radio 4, who makes the point that even if Jeremy Hunt actually eyes a kind of cut in 1% cut in income tax or something like that, that you're talking about somewhere in the region of 6 or 7 billion. And yet, in terms of these stealth taxes, as they're called, freezing the tax thresholds, therefore more people have been dragged into higher tax brackets, it dwarfs that amount. So it's the sort of thing where they've essentially, because the tax burden is so high at this point, not least because of some of these stealth taxes, the government would effectively be giving you back a little bit of the large amount that they've already taken. Yeah. But again, memories are quite short sometimes when you go into the polling booth. So it's finely balanced, I think, in terms of what will actually make a difference.
I think it's all spin. It's all spin.
It's all they've got at this point.
But it does put Keir Starmer... well, he can't sit on the fence on this, can he? He's got to say something about tax now.
He does, but his fence-sitting is his kind of natural stance, unfortunately, so I don't know how it's going.
Not an election campaign, but...
He has tried to turn... There's that old kind of truism about elections that oppositions don't win them, incumbent governments lose them. He's tried to turn that into an entire philosophy. He tries to say absolutely nothing. Occasionally, when he has tried to make a kind of a big policy announcement, the 28 billion green investment and so on, he's forced to back down from it a few weeks later. I do wonder whether that's going to work for him. I don't think that it's unlike... I think it's very likely he's still going to win the next election, but will it be as convincing as the polls suggest, given there's so little clarity as to what it is he actually wants to do? I'm not too sure.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. Should we talk about marriage, Lara?
Favourite subject.
Is it? Really? Why? Is there...
I've been married for nearly 30 years. I think it's the bedrock of our society. There's been many times my husband would say the same, whereas if we hadn't been married, he'd have left me or I'd have left him. You need marriage for children. If you're not having children, that's a different argument. I think for children, the security it gives. What was fewer than half
of British adults
figures, isn't it?
are married or in a civil partnership.
Yeah.
And it's the first time it's fallen down below
including same-sex marriage, which I thought was interesting. You'd have thought it might have gone up. So it really is a big decline.
But what would you say to someone like Jen, then, who's been in touch? Says, we've been together for 40 years, 3 children, 8 grandchildren. It was my decision not to marry. However, I feel after road testing him, I'd quite like to marry him, but it's too expensive.
Road test
It's about the money. You
That
can just
road
go
test
into a
lasted
church
40
and get a priest. You know, I'm a devout Catholic, so I come from that stance that I think it's just a beautiful institution. It's not to say it's perfect, but if with society you don't start with this is how ideally it should be, we should never go back to the days where you chastise and punish people for being single mothers. I'm not saying that at all, but if it's not the blueprint, so if someone says, when they're not married, I'm having a baby, of course, you know, you're going to say lovely and all the rest of it, but to celebrate it, like, someone very close to me at the moment is having a baby and they are getting married next week. And I was so happy to hear it. They're having the baby in May and they're getting married next week because they feel it's really, really important to... They say, if we can't commit to each other, then why...
I've heard so many people say, we're not getting married because it's just too expensive.
Oh, rubbish.
You think, why does it have to be expensive?
No,
That's what the problem is?
People getting married for the wrong reasons.
Wrong reasons.
Want a party.
Yes. Just go the two of you and, you know, say your vows and get married.
Do you fancy popping the question at any point, Tom?
It's none of your business, Steve. No, but it is interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, as you say, the arguments that are made as to why people aren't getting married, I think the financial one seems the least convincing because that's always going to be a bit of a problem, isn't it? I mean, and also the fact that, you know, you don't have to have a fabulously expensive wedding. That's not a requirement.
But people seem to think they do.
And there is a bit of keeping up with the Joneses that goes on. I do understand that. But I do just wonder if it's... this does just seem to be the direction of travel. I don't know what anyone can do to try to reverse it necessarily,
it's the glue,
culturally.
isn't it?
It is the glue, but it is also the security. I mean, I was lucky my parents were happily married, but I knew as a child that they would never, ever leave each other because I just knew that. It was just... and it gave me such security, just knowing...
I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also that, you know...
Emily says, morning, Emily, what difference does it make being married? I wish I hadn't married that idiot. I could have walked away and not looked back instead of having to go through a very expensive and long drawn-out nasty divorce.